All right, let's talk about performance appraisals. Love them or hate them, they're a huge part of pretty much any job. But have you ever really stopped to think about why they exist? What's the point? Well, today we're going to unpack that whole process.
Yeah, you ever sit there wondering how that pay raise actually gets decided? It's not just a gut feeling from your boss, or at least it's not supposed to be. It's usually part of a much bigger, more formal system. And that system is all about tackling one of the biggest questions any business has to answer. And that question is, how do we hang on to our best people? Seriously, think about it from the company side for a second. It costs a ton of money and time to recruit, hire, and train you. So they absolutely need a way to manage that talent and make sure their investment doesn't just, walk out the door.
So that brings us to the why. Let's get right into it. Why do performance reviews even exist? Why go through all the paperwork and all those meetings? What's the real point behind it all? Well, like we were just saying, after a company has invested all that time and money in recruiting, selecting, and training their people, they can't just cross their fingers and hope for the best. They need a system, a way to manage and retain that talent. It's all about protecting and growing that initial investment they made in their employees. Okay, so what do we actually call this thing? Let's define the system, because it's a lot more than just that one awkward chat you have with your manager every year. The official name for it is a performance management system. And really, the whole point is right there in a definition. It's a process for setting standards and then evaluating performance so HR can make objective decisions. That's the key word, objective. The goal is to get away from a manager's personal feelings and instead use clear, measurable data to make those big calls. And we're talking about some really key decisions here. The results from these appraisals, they can totally shape your career. We're talking pay increases, promotions, figuring out if you need some specific training to level up, and, of course, it's all documented for any official personnel actions. It's a big deal. Okay, so that's the what and why, but what about the how? Let's look at the appraisal toolkit. How do managers actually, do the evaluating? Well, there are a bunch of different ways to do it, and each one has its upsides and downsides. Take the written essay method. Super simple to use, right? But are you measuring the employee's performance or just how good the evaluator is at writing? Then, on the total opposite end of the spectrum, you've got something like the 360-degree appraisal. It gives you this incredibly thorough feedback from all angles, but man, is it time-consuming. And speaking of the 360 method, it has become wildly popular. Get this, something like 90% of Fortune 1000 companies use it. And it makes sense why. The whole idea is to get a complete, well-rounded picture of your performance by pulling in feedback not just from your boss, but from your coworkers, the people you manage, and sometimes even clients or customers. So this table gives you a nice little snapshot of the manager's toolkit. You've got critical incidents, which is all about documenting specific examples of great or not so great work. Graphic rating scales are those familiar rate from 1 to 5 things. They give you quick data. And then you get into the more complex stuff, like BARS. That stands for Behaviorally Anchored Rating Scales, super specific stuff, and MBO, Management by Objectives. That last one is all about one thing. Did you hit the concrete goals that you and your boss set together? Okay, so we've collected all this data, we've done the review. Now what? How does this all go from being a review on paper to, well, reality? Let's talk about the thing that's probably on everyone's mind. Yeah, your pay. Now, your appraisal is a huge piece of that puzzle, for sure, but it's not the only piece. A whole bunch of things influence what you actually take home. Stuff like the kind of job you have, how long you've been there, how well the company's doing financially, where you live, and whether or not there's a union involved. But what happens if an employee isn't meeting their goals? Because this whole system isn't just for handing out raises and promotions, it's also designed to be a clear, structured way to deal with performance problems when they pop up. And there's usually a pretty standard path for underperformance. It doesn't just go from 0 to you're fired. First, a good manager tries to figure out the why. What's the root cause here? Then they'll usually try some kind of employee counseling. And only after that do things potentially escalate to more serious disciplinary action. And let's be clear about employee counseling. The idea here isn't just to punish someone. It's about helping them figure out what's wrong and overcome it. From a purely business standpoint, it's almost always cheaper and more effective to help a current employee improve than to go through the whole costly process of firing and hiring someone new. It's about getting people back on track. Okay, but sometimes performance management runs into much bigger and honestly tougher situations when things get difficult for the entire company. We're talking about things like downsizing. That's basically the planned elimination of jobs, usually to cut costs when the economy is bad, or frankly, when a company has been mismanaged, and it's one of the hardest things a business can go through.
Because the impact isn't just on the people who leave. You have to ask, what about the people who stay, the survivors? They're often left dealing with a whole set of very real, very difficult psychological issues.
There's actually a term for this, layoff survivor sickness, and it perfectly captures that weird, complex mix of feelings. You've got job insecurity, of course, but also things like guilt, maybe even a little bit of anger, and almost always a drop in commitment to the company. So, what can managers do to reduce that trauma? This is so critical. Good leadership means you're not just focused on who's leaving, you're actively supporting who's staying. That means providing counseling, letting people talk it out in group discussions, maybe giving them more control over their work, and just making sure they know without a doubt that they are still valuable and absolutely needed. And all of this really leads us to the central question, doesn't it? As our workplaces keep changing, how do we balance that need for objective measurement with the fundamental human need for support and fairness? That's the real challenge. And figuring that out, well, that's the future of managing performance. Thanks for diving into this with me.